There is a moment that most people never talk about. It is not dramatic. There is no sudden breakdown, no lightning bolt from the sky. It arrives quietly somewhere between your morning routine and the end of another long day. And it feels like this, like you are watching your own life from behind glass, like you are present but not really there. If you have ever felt that, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not broken. What you are experiencing has a name. Psychologists and researchers have studied it for over a century. And what they have discovered is something that will completely change the way you see your discomfort, your restlessness, and that deep feeling that something in your life urgently needs to change. Stay with me, because what we are about to go through is not surface-level motivation. This is grounded in real psychological science. And by the end of this, you will understand yourself in a way you never have before. Let us begin with something the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung wrote in the early 20th century. He spent decades studying the human mind, not just the troubled mind, but the mind of the average functioning person. And what he found disturbed him deeply. He wrote that the most dangerous thing in modern life is not mental illness. It is not poverty, failure, or suffering. The most dangerous thing, he argued, is what he called unconscious adaptation, the process by which a human being slowly molds themselves into a shape that society approves of, while the authentic self quietly suffocates underneath. He called the mask we wear in public the persona. It is not a bad thing necessarily. We all need to adapt. We all need to function within a social world. But Jung warned that when a person becomes so fused with their persona, so committed to performing the role others expect, they eventually lose contact with who they actually are. And that loss does not announce itself loudly. It creeps in like fog. You do not wake up one morning and say, "I have lost myself." You just notice slowly that mornings feel heavier, that the things that used to excite you no longer do, that you are performing your life rather than living it. This is not a personal fail. This is a psychological phenomenon that affects millions of people, and it is the starting point of something far more important. There is a concept in developmental psychology called the false self, described extensively by British pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. Winnicott spent years working with children and observed something remarkable. When a child grows up in an environment where their authentic expressions, their anger, their curiosity, their sadness, their wildness, are consistently met with disapproval or punishment, they learn to hide those parts of themselves. They develop a false self, a curated version of who they are that earns approval, avoids conflict, and keeps the peace. And here is the critical part. This coping mechanism is brilliant in childhood. It is a survival strategy. But when that child grows into an adult, the false self keeps running. The performance continues. The authentic self remains buried, and the adult begins to feel, without being able to explain why, that something essential is missing from their life. They may have a good job, a stable relationship, a circle of friends, and a life that looks perfectly fine from the outside. But inside, there is a persistent, quiet ache, an existential hollowness that no achievement seems to fill. Sound familiar? Here is what modern neuroscience adds to this picture. Researchers studying psychological well-being have identified what they call eudaimonic living, a term rooted in Aristotle's philosophy, referring to a life of meaning and authentic self-expression, as opposed to hedonic well-being, which is simply the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Studies from the field of positive psychology, including work by researchers Martin Seligman and Carol Riff, have consistently shown that people who live primarily in hedonic mode, chasing comfort, approval, and distraction, report higher levels of anxiety, emptiness, and a pervasive sense of meaninglessness, even when their external circumstances appear favorable. In other words, a comfortable life and a meaningful life are not the same thing. And the human mind knows the difference, even when the human being tries to convince themselves otherwise. Your restlessness is not irrational. It is your deeper psychology registering a deficit, not a deficit of success, a deficit of authenticity. Now, this is where it gets both uncomfortable and important. The emotional symptoms most people experience when this deficit grows large enough, the anxiety, the chronic low-grade sadness, the feeling of not belonging even in familiar places, the exhaustion that sleep does not fix, these are not malfunctions. They are signals. Jung introduced a framework for understanding this that he called the process of individuation. It is the psychological journey toward wholeness, toward becoming the fully integrated person you are capable of being rather than remaining a fragmented collection of approved performances. Individuation, Jung argued, is not a luxury. It is a psychological necessity. The human psyche has an inherent drive toward integration, toward coherence, toward authenticity. When that drive is consistently blocked by fear, by social pressure, by the demands of conformity, it does not disappear. It builds pressure, and eventually it finds an outlet. For some people, that outlet is depression. For others, it is physical illness. For others still, it is the kind of existential crisis that forces them to stop, look up from the conveyor belt of routine, and ask, for perhaps the first time in years, is this actually the life I want to be living? That question, uncomfortable as it is not a symptom of dysfunction. It is the psyche doing exactly what it is designed to do. It is calling you toward growth. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to write one of the most important psychological texts of the 20th century, Man's Search for Meaning, described something he witnessed repeatedly among the prisoners around him. He noticed that those who maintained a sense of meaning, a reason to survive, a purpose that extended beyond the immediate suffering, demonstrated a psychological resilience that defied the horrific conditions they were enduring, while those who had lost all sense of meaning deteriorated far more rapidly, not always physically but psychologically. They stopped caring. They stopped trying. They faded. Frankl concluded that the deepest human need is not for pleasure, not even for safety, but for meaning. He called the absence of meaning existential vacuum, a state of inner emptiness that breeds apathy, aggression, and a pervasive sense of pointlessness. And here is the sobering reality. Frankl wrote about existential vacuum not as a rare condition affecting only those in extreme circumstances. He described it as a mass phenomenon of the 20th century. A widespread cultural illness born from a world that tells people what to do, what to consume, and what to want, but rarely invites them to discover who they are and why they are here. That was in the 1960s. The conditions he described have not improved. In many ways, they have intensified. So what does this mean for you practically? It means that the discomfort you are feeling is directional. It is pointing at something. And the direction it is almost always pointing is inward, toward the parts of yourself that have been neglected, suppressed, or denied. Psychologist Abraham Maslow, famous for his hierarchy of needs, spent the later years of his career studying what he called self-actualization, the process of becoming fully oneself. He observed a small percentage of people he believed had genuinely achieved this, and he noted something fascinating about all of them. None of them had arrived there easily. None had simply decided to be authentic and found the path clear. Every single one of them had passed through a period of significant discomfort, disorientation, and internal conflict. A period where the old version of themselves could no longer hold, and the new version had not yet fully formed. Maslow called this the liminal state, a threshold, a place of in-between. If you are in that place right now, if you feel like you are standing on the edge of something you cannot yet name, that is not a crisis. That is a crossing. But here is the part most psychological self-help content skips over, and it is the part that matters most. None of this transformation happens automatically. It does not happen just because you understand it intellectually. Understanding the concept of the false self does not dissolve it. Reading about individuation does not initiate it. What initiates it is a decision, not a dramatic, cinematic decision, not a grand gesture or a public declaration. A quiet, private, deeply personal decision to stop outsourcing the responsibility for your own inner life to other people, other systems, other timelines that never seem to arrive. Psychologists refer to this as the shift from an external locus of control to an internal locus of control. Research by Julian Rotter, who developed the concept in the 1950s, demonstrated that individuals who believe their outcomes are primarily determined by their own choices and actions, an internal locus, consistently demonstrate higher levels of resilience, well-being, and life satisfaction than those who believe their outcomes are determined primarily by external forces, luck, other people, circumstances. This is not about blaming yourself for everything that has happened to you. Much of what has shaped you was entirely outside your control. Childhood environments, cultural conditioning, the families you were born into, the experiences you did not choose. But what is within your control, and this is non-negotiable, is what you do next. Jung described the moment of genuine psychological turning as what happens when a person becomes, as he put it, sufficiently tired of the wrong life. Not just intellectually dissatisfied with it. Viscerally, bone-deep tired of it. Tired of performing, tired of shrinking, tired of waiting for permission to be who they actually are. That exhaustion, when it reaches a certain depth, becomes fuel. It becomes the energy source for change. And the fear you feel when you stand at that threshold, and you will feel it, because fear is the nervous system's natural response to uncertainty. That fear is not a stop sign. Research in emotion science, including work from psychologist Susan David at Harvard Medical School, has shown that emotional discomfort and psychological growth are not opposites. They are partners. David coined the term emotional agility to describe the capacity to move through difficult emotions with curiosity rather than avoidance. Her research and the broader body of acceptance and commitment therapy literature demonstrates consistently that people who learn to sit with discomfort rather than escape it develop greater clarity, stronger values alignment, and far more meaningful lives than those who prioritize emotional comfort above all else. The fear is not proof that you are heading in the wrong direction. In most cases, it is proof that you are heading in exactly the right one. So let us bring this together. You are here because something in your inner world is shifting, because the version of your life you have been maintaining is running up against its limits, because the gap between who you perform being and who you actually are has grown wide enough that you can no longer ignore it. That gap, that specific, personal, uncomfortable gap, is not a flaw in your character. It is the opening through which something more real can emerge. The work ahead of you is not easy. Real psychological growth rarely is. It requires a willingness to look at parts of yourself you have spent years avoiding. Your shadow, as Jung called it, the repressed emotions, the denied desires, the buried grief, the anger you were taught to hide. All of it needs to be acknowledged before it can be integrated. But the research is clear on one thing. The people who do this work, who commit to the difficult, unglamorous, deeply personal process of becoming more genuinely themselves, report greater levels of well-being, deeper relationships, more meaningful work, and a kind of quiet confidence that does not depend on external validation. Not because life becomes easier, but because they become more real. And a real life, even a difficult one, is infinitely more livable than a comfortable performance. You do not need to have it figured out. You do not need a perfect plan or a clear destination. What you need right now is simply the honesty to acknowledge where you are, and the courage to take one step that is more true to who you actually are than the step you would have taken yesterday. That is how it begins, not with a dramatic transformation, with a single, quiet, genuine choice. The psyche is already pointing you in the right direction. The signals are already there. The question is not whether you can see them. The question is whether you are ready to follow them. And if you have made it to the end of this, something in you already knows the answer.